welcome to day 22 of our Lent Readings for 2026 as we continue to follow a series on verses that every Christian should know. Today we're in the first chapter of Colossians and I'm going to read the verses through twice. Colossians 1:15-16. The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. Colossians 1 verses 15-16. The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. If you've ever engaged a Jehovah's Witness in conversation about spiritual matters, and you've let them know that you're a Christian, I'm speaking here of those who take the traditional view that there is one God revealed in three persons, a belief we call the Trinity, then one of the passages they're likely to turn to is the one we have before us today. The reason is that all Bibles translate verse 15 pretty much the same, including their own version, the New World Translation, which isn't a guarantee for many of the verses they will ask you about. However, their interpretation of this verse supports the view that Jesus is not divine. They read, "The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation," and say, aha, Jesus is the firstborn of creation, created in God's image, as we were, and that means he was Jehovah's first act of creation, and therefore he is a created being rather than God. You might now ask, so why have I chosen one of the verses that the Jehovah's Witnesses use as a proof text? The answer is they misunderstand this verse, and in fact it says the opposite of what they think it does, and it's good for us to know what Paul is actually saying here. The issue revolves around the phrase firstborn over all creation. They read it as God's first creative act was to create Christ, who then went on to create the universe. However, it does not say first created, but firstborn. There are two Greek words Paul could have used for the word created, and he uses neither of them. The phrase he does use is loaded with Old Testament meaning. Firstborn is not so much about being the oldest, but about being the heir, the inheritor. Firstborn is not chronological, such as firstborn, secondborn, thirdborn, etc., because it's not about birth order, it's about birth right. In Exodus 4:22, Israel is called God's firstborn. This is not saying that Israel was the first nation to ever exist, but they are the inheritors of God's promise to Abraham. Reuben was the oldest of the sons of Jacob, but his sinful behaviour in sleeping with his father's concubine, Bilhah, recorded in Genesis 35, meant he forfeited his birthright as the oldest child. In 1 Chronicles 5 it begins, "Reuben was the firstborn of Jacob, but when he defiled his father's marriage bed, his rights as firstborn were given to the sons of Joseph, son of Israel, so he could not be listed in the genealogical record in accordance with his birthright." Having established that this verse is not talking about Jesus being created, the start of the verse where it says Jesus is the image of the invisible God now makes sense, in that it is saying that Jesus is the image of the invisible God, not that he was created in the image of the invisible God, as we have been. He always has been and always will be. Jesus is the heir of creation, for all creation is his inheritance. In fact, that is exactly what it says at the end of verse 16, as we read, "All things were created by him and for him." So let's read both verses together once again. Colossians 1:15-16. The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. Amen. Till next time, have a blessed day.